The official 2024 Song of Ice and Fire calendar features a very interesting cover image. It shows us Rhaegar and Lyanna standing under a very large weirwood surrounded by a green forest and looking very happy together, with blue winter roses growing in the ground. The weirwood itself is also very interesting. Weirwoods have been on the cover of the A Song of Ice and Fire calendar before, and when they are depicted in images you always can recognize them, but this one is a little different. Every other time you see a weirwood depicted in one of the A Song of Ice and Fire calendars, or generally just in official art, you always notice the striking red leaves, or potentially even the red sap that flows out of these weirwoods. But on this one, there's none of it. It's all green. Now this is actually a bit of very good news for me, because one of the things that I had predicted was that when we see the Isle of Faces, there's a pretty decent chance we're going to see weirwoods with green leaves. And now that we've actually been shown this, on some level at least, in an official image with George R.R. Martin's name slapped right on there, it seems to add a lot more evidence and a lot more context to some of the things that I've been talking about for the last few months on the channel. One of the things that I have speculated on is the idea that the leaves for all the different magical trees that we see in A Song of Ice and Fire might all be giving us a hint as to the power source. The color of the leaves matches the color of the power source. So the blood-red hands of the weirwood leaves are because they are using human blood as a power source. The blue leaves of the trees that we see in Essos are because the power source at the House of the Undying is blue shadows who are color-matched to the leaves of the trees, and the trees seem to be sapping power from these trapped shadows in the same way that the warlocks are. So if you have blood magic trees and you have shadow magic trees where the color of the leaves are matching the color of the power source, well then what about green magic trees? Trees that are doing the original life creation sort of magic that we hear about in the ancient tales with Garth the Green, and what is allegedly done by the green men on the Isle of Faces. I have a whole video about the Isle of Faces, and we'll get into the ideas behind that in a moment, but just on a surface level, if they are in fact doing green magic and have green magic weirwoods on the Isle of Faces, which is one of the things that I talk about, right? Before the Pact, there was this green magic that used to be done in the Age of Heroes. After the Pact, we know that there isn't really green magic like Garth the Green being done today in Westeros, but what do we see? We see trees used for blood magic. Seems like there was a corruption of the magic at some point in this story, and perhaps what happened was, when the Pact was formed, and the people started worshipping and feeding blood to the weirwood trees, that was the corruption. The Isle of Faces could have been a place where they essentially stored the old ways of green magic, guarded by the green men, which would be why on the Isle of Faces there could potentially be weirwoods with green leaves. This was the speculation that I had put forward, and then all of a sudden the 2024 calendar drops, and what do we see? Likely the Isle of Faces, with a big weirwood, and not a red leaf to be found. So I take this image being the cover image for the calendar, as I said, with George's name slapped right on there officially. This is some pretty good evidence, in my opinion, that on at least the very basic level, I'm correct with what I was speculating is going on with the Isle of Faces. It is a seed vault of some sort for green magic, and you should definitely check out the whole little, basically all of December's videos. We're sort of building up around this idea of the weirwoods and what's going on with them in the Isle of Faces. It's a whole big thing. If you're interested and haven't seen them already, definitely check them out. I think you'll enjoy it. If you want the absolute quick, short version of it and don't want to watch all of those interesting and cool videos, well, basically we're getting a tale of rebirth in the style of Norse mythology, a meeting of ice and fire, which will eventually lead to a rebirth of a new age for the world. At least that's the idea. And the weirwoods, at the beginning of the age, were a source of green magic that has been corrupted. Early in the first book, Bran even thinks that trees ought not have eyes or leaves that look like human hands. And then in A Dance with Dragons, very late in the book, Asha Greyjoy gets her first up-close look at a weirwood, and she's really freaked out because she's always been told, oh yeah, there's just red sap that flows through the weirwoods, it looks like blood, but it's not. And when she gets up close, she sees it for the first time, and she goes, no, that's human blood that's flowing out of that tree. It's frozen blood. So the really relevant part of the whole idea for what we're talking about here today is that if the Isle of Faces itself is a seed vault for green magic, as I said, what they could have done is had the green men there guarding some weirwoods that were cut off from the rest of the weirwood system, which was then used for blood magic, in case that whole process, goes terribly, which it seems to have done. And then what they could do is they have a place where they can come back to the original roots of green magic and try to start again. And essentially, I think that's the point of the Green Men, the Isle of Faces, and I think we're going to go through a cycle of rebirth by the end of this story, and that's why they're going to be so important. So hopefully that's enough context for you to understand why I'm so excited when it was pointed out to me that the 2024 A Song of Ice and Fire calendar has a cover image that seems to show a weirwood with nothing but green leaves. But I do feel like I should do the work of just establishing why I think it's so likely that this image is, in fact, on the Isle of Faces. Now, people who are deep into A Song of Ice and Fire theories will probably just take that as a given because it's right next to Harrenhal, it's a speculated location that Rhaegar and Lyanna could have gotten married in many theories already, so many people I think are pretty willing to accept that if they are near a giant weirwood, and it's Rhaegar and Lyanna while they're briefly together, the Isle of Faces is definitely the leading candidate for that. There is also a line from Catelyn early in the Game of Thrones, which is, again, when George thought the series was going to be much shorter, and the early chapters of Game of Thrones, he's really going hard on lots of clues and hints as to where he's going with things. And one of the things he mentions is how all of the weirwoods in the south had been cut down except for the Isle of Faces where the green men kept their silent watch. So if there's going to be a giant plot-relevant weirwood situation going on with Rhaegar and Lyanna, it probably happened on the Isle of Faces. This has been retconned, obviously, as he's written more books and expanded the world. There are weirwoods south of the Neck that aren't on the Isle of Faces, but I think the most important ones, the ones that are likely going to be relevant to the endgame of the story, are probably on the Isle of Faces. So again, the geography, they're very close to each other. It all just seems very likely that Rhaegar and Lyanna being together, they are going to be on the Isle of Faces if they're next to a giant weirwood. Now, if you know your lore, the significance of Rhaegar and Lyanna making it to the Isle of Faces is not lost on you. There are very few people who have ever made it to the Isle of Faces, and basically, if these two have made it, we are pretty much doubling our confirmed count. There was at least one around the dance, which I won't go into to avoid House of the Dragon spoilers in case you don't want those, and then Howland Reed himself is confirmed to go to the Isle of Faces. Howland Reed and Lyanna obviously are an interesting connection because around the time of the tourney of Harrenhal, you have them meeting for the whole Night of the Laughing Tree shenanigans and the story that Mira and Jojen tell to Bran. So all of this kind of ties together to paint a fuzzy but logical picture that Lyanna and Howland would have probably talked about the Isle of Faces when Lyanna and Rhaegar were running away and needing some place to hide. Perhaps Lyanna would have suggested the Isle of Faces, which could have been perhaps the plan of the Green Men and the Weirwood Trees, whoever you want to say is in charge. That could have been their entire plan the entire time. So whoever you think is in charge in the end, whether it's time-traveling Bran or the trees themselves or the old gods working through the trees in some way, someone's plan seems to have been laid out by the Green Men, by the Isle of Faces, and then Rhaegar and Lyanna seem to have ended up there. Now this is a pretty significant piece of lore to be dropped in a calendar if it is indeed canon, and I do just want to do a little bit of work looking back at the old A Song of Ice and Fire calendars to show that yes, many of these images that have come from the calendars are many of the official images that we sort of consider the canon representation of different castles or different characters. Some of them will be showing up on the screen right now, and I'm sure you'll recognize many of the images that have come from previous versions of the calendar, and if you'd like to do an in-depth dive yourself, Westeros.org has a bunch of images of all of the calendars and their backs, so you can see all the different pictures that have come from them. Now, as I have looked through all of these images, I haven't seen anything that I would say, oh no, that never happened, that wasn't canon. There's nothing that's completely wild and coming out of left field that is just being dropped in these calendars. These are generally images of things that have happened. So the history of all these calendar images, along with the fact that, as I said, this has George R.R. Martin's name slapped right on the front of it as published by George R.R. Martin, this is like something that is officially in his catalog of published works, well, I would say that all comes together to make a pretty compelling case that you can take what you see in these calendars, at least on some level, to build theories, to draw conclusions. This is, in some level or another, canon stuff that we're seeing in these calendars. In fact, when I was going back and looking at all the old images in the A Song of Ice and Fire calendars, I happened to notice that, really, I think the two most interesting images both come from this year. Because in addition to the cover image where we seem to see Rhaegar and Lyanna on the Isle of Faces, we also get an image that seems to be confirmation of someone fighting the others as they ride ice spiders. We have seen images of the others before, but generally they are just riding a dead horse, or they are riding their dead horse and leading some wights, which are things that we know that they can do. But this year we get a glimpse of several others climbing up something, and someone is fighting them off with a sword as they all ride on the back of ice spiders. To me, this is the coolest and the most wild image that we've probably gotten of the others in any of these calendars. To me, ice spiders are a big step up from dead horses and leading armies of wights. So if this calendar is indeed as lore solid as I think it is, we are getting some major bomb drops in the 2024 Ice and Fire calendar. Not only did Rhaegar and Lyanna make it to the Isle of Faces where there seems to be weirwoods with no red leaves, but we also seem to get Old Nan stories about ice spiders being confirmed. So all in all, the 2024 calendar to me is really, really shocking. The fact that we're getting these images that could potentially be scenes from Winds of Winter, or scenes that have happened off screen that their details will be revealed in Winds of Winter, makes me feel like maybe we're actually getting a little bit closer to Winds of Winter on a real level. Instead of, the way we're always getting closer to the Winds of Winter because it will come eventually and that's how time works. Like, maybe I'm being overly optimistic here, but I don't think that they would be moving on to depicting more and more scenes that will probably be showing up in Winds of Winter if Winds of Winter didn't feel a little bit closer. And let me know down in the comments if you have any guesses for what this scene could actually be depicting. My personal belief is that I think this could be Hardhome in the books, because it doesn't necessarily look like these others are climbing up the wall, but this could fit the way that Hardhome is sort of described, and this could be a wildling at Hardhome fighting off the others' invasion. Whether we'll actually see that in a POV in the Winds of Winter or not, I don't know, but I do think that that's a very good chance that that is the scene that we have depicted. So again, something that is very likely going to be talked about in the Winds of Winter could be being depicted in the 2024 Ice and Fire calendar. And I'm really curious to hear what you all think in general down in the comments. Am I going too far taking these calendar images to try and draw bits of lore from, or does it seem completely reasonable given the context of all the calendars we've gotten in the past? And what do you think? Is there any alternative theories for where this could be with Rhaegar and Lyanna? Do you think that the fact that there's not a single bit of red in the entire picture, in contrast to every other weirwood image we've ever gotten in the calendar, is important? I think it's probably important, but let me know what you all think down in the comments. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, and I'll see you with something else very soon.